Welcome to the Mind Solution podcast with Sara Maude. The Mind Solution podcast is for leaders like you who are passionate about well-being in the workplace because you understand that a strong, resilient and happy workforce is the key to your organisation's success. The Mind Solution podcast is here to help you. So join us every week where we'll share with you powerful insights, strategies and know-how to ensure that your people and your organisation are truly thriving from the inside out. Hello and welcome back. And I'm so excited to share this episode with you because what I'm going to share with you here today has the ability to truly revolutionise well-being in the workplace. This is the key that turns the lock. Because when people see what I'm about to share with you, it shifts everything. Because the truth is that the vast majority of people are walking around navigating their day from a filter system. And that filter system, that sense of self, is made up of their thoughts and their beliefs. And it's a little bit like wearing a pair of goggles. You can only see things from your current level of thinking. And a belief is just a thought that you've kept thinking again and again and again. So it's become a neural pathway in the brain. But these thoughts and these beliefs are how we experience life through. So it's like if you can imagine those 3D reality goggles, you can only experience life through that 3D reality, through that level of thinking. And that level of thinking, those beliefs have created an identity based on who you think you are. And that filter system impacts how you experience life moment to moment to moment. So if you have somebody who thinks that they are an anxious person, then that's going to be the filter system for how they're experiencing life in any given moment. And I've seen this countless times, both through my one-to-one work and through the employee wellbeing webinars and the management mental health training that I run, that if I think I'm an anxious person, I believe I'm an anxious person, I've created an identity. This identity that this is who I am. I'm identifying with that. I'm identifying with these thoughts. And if I think about myself as an anxious person, then I'm always going to be hypervigilant. I'm going to be scanning the future. In my mind, I'm going to be thinking worst case scenario. I'm going to be overthinking everything. Same with if you've got somebody who has a belief that I'm inadequate, I'm incompetent. They've identified with that thought so much that it's become an identity. Same with even stress. People believe that stress is something that's created from their environment, from the things that they're dealing with at work, through the task that they've got on their calendar that morning, from a meeting that they've just had. I'm feeling this stress. And so this stress is coming from this situation. It's coming from this conversation. It's coming from whatever it is that I've got to do on my to-do list. But none of that is true. What's creating your experience in any given moment is the filter system. It's the level of thinking. And those thoughts, when we're in those thoughts, they create feelings. They create feelings in the body. Everything that you experience is thought generated. Now, some people say to me, yeah, but Sara, I was in this situation and I wasn't thinking anything consciously. There were no thoughts running through my mind, but I was feeling unsettled. I was feeling uncomfortable. I was feeling anxious, fearful, frustrated, guilty, angry, anything. And what happens is that when we keep identifying with thought, we're not just creating neural pathways in the brain, we're also conditioning the autonomic nervous system. And so we can find ourselves reacting to a situation, and it doesn't seem like it's coming from thoughts taking form in the moment because the body experiences an emotional hit before the mind catches up. Now, the thing about thoughts is that thoughts themselves are not the problem. Thoughts come and go. In fact, there isn't actually a thinker. Thoughts arise within consciousness. And most of the thoughts that we think, in fact, the vast majority of thoughts that we think, are not new thoughts, they're recycled thoughts. About 99.9% of our thoughts are habitual. They're automatic. They sound like broken records. The problem comes when we identify with a thought or a series of thoughts, or we're caught in a mental loop of thinking. And we're identifying with those thoughts as truth, as fact. We're making these thoughts mean something about ourselves, about the situation that we're in. And when we're in these mental thought loops, well, they create that filter. We can only ever see life, experience life from our current level of thinking. And yet, all of these thoughts, these beliefs, this identity, this sense of self is simply the personal mind, the egoic mind. It's the character. It's the character of who we are being at any moment in time. And that personal mind, that limited ego self, it naturally reacts to circumstances based on all of this past programming. And that past programming, everything that we've ever experienced, when we get an emotional hit, it feels absolutely real. It feels like the way that I feel is coming from this situation. But it never is. It's simply a pattern match back to the totality of all of our experiences. That most people are walking around from the level of the unconscious mind. And we know that science has shown that time and time again through clinical studies, that how we're experiencing life more than 90% of the time is from that unconscious mind, from this set of thought patterns, beliefs, programs, behaviors, which is why we find ourselves repeating these same patterns again and again and again. And then we think, well, maybe this is just who I am. Maybe there's something wrong with me. I'm broken. Maybe I can't change. Maybe this is my personality. I've lost count of the amount of times that I've heard that from people. Because if we believe that we can't change, if we believe that this is who I am, it's going to look that way. And what I point people back to, both in my private work and when I'm running training for organizations, is the awareness that's able to observe these thoughts, that's able to observe the emotions, that's able to observe the beliefs. Because the truth of who you are, and I know this might sound really radical, but it is the truth. The truth of who we are is not the character. It's not the thoughts. It's not the beliefs. Our true identity is the awareness of the personal mind. And yet, what so many people do is they drag stories from the past into the present. And that creates this sense of reality. It keeps us locked in this sense of self. It keeps us locked in the past. And for some people that think this is who I am, that there's something wrong with me, I need to fix myself. When they start to see what's really unfolding is that I'm just identifying with these thoughts, well, then you're no longer in the thought. You're the awareness, the consciousness that's able to observe that. And you have thousands of thoughts a day that arise from all of this past data. And they're not something that you choose. Thoughts are always going to be arising. But they only create suffering when we identify with those thoughts. When we keep revisiting these thoughts, we keep accepting them as truth. That we keep thinking, I need to pay attention to these thoughts. That these thoughts are real, that they're giving me some kind of real information about the situation. But our thoughts that are recycled, they're habitual, they're never giving us any real information about the situation. They're simply conditioned, habitual thoughts based on all of this past data. And so when we find ourselves in these old patterns, it's simply a temporary identification with a familiar sensation or a story. And when we get triggered, and we all do because we are having this human experience, that triggering just shows us where we're operating from these normal habitual responses. And reality is shaped by that. But when we can get really good at noticing, by noticing that we're aware of the reaction, when we can observe the reaction, we can observe the thinking, we can see, you know what, this is what I'm making this situation mean based on my thinking. Well, then we are in that place of creating a gap between ourselves and this character, this sense of self. And that is true empowerment. The way that I often describe this is like a cinema screen or a movie screen. Now, if you go into a cinema, the movie screen is always there. It's always present. And depending on what it is that you've gone to see, there are some characters on that screen that are anxious, they're stressed, they're burnt out, they're agitated, they're fearful. And there are other characters that are happy, they're joyful, they're productive, they're in love with life. The character comes and goes, but the screen is always present. And so when it comes to really transforming well-being in the workplace, what I see again and again is organizations wanting to give people tools and techniques for managing stress, for managing pressure. And it's not that there's anything wrong with that per se. We can teach people techniques like how to ground themselves. We can teach them emotional freedom technique. We can teach them techniques and tools and breath work and all of this. But if people don't understand fundamentally what is creating their experience, then these kinds of tools and techniques are only going to take them so far, because they will keep finding themselves back in these automatic, habitual thought loops. They will keep viewing situations from their current level of awareness, from their current level of thinking. They'll keep internalizing situations through their thinking, through their belief system. So when we can come back to the awareness of what's just being played out like a character on a movie screen, well, then the mind starts to settle. And for some people, being really honest with you, for some people that have experienced certain mental health conditions like anxiety and depression, for example, for a really long time, it can look to them that the way that I feel is who I am. It can look to them like the way that I feel is permanent. And it might be that they've used your EAP scheme and they've had 6 sessions of counselling. And maybe some of that has been helpful in unpacking some of the things that they've experienced in their life, but it hasn't fundamentally shifted how they are showing up day to day, because they keep falling back into these habitual thoughts and these habitual beliefs. And somebody that's experiencing depression, and I've seen this in my private work, is they've got these goggles on that are very black or white, all or nothing. Somebody that's experienced feeling depression for a long time, they've got very low energy. And it really can seem like this is never going to change. It can seem to them that they are powerless, that they need something outside of themselves to change before they can start to feel better. But what I've seen and I've witnessed is that when people start to understand the nature of thought, when they start to see that thoughts really are just something that come and they go, that they don't have any power over us unless we are giving them power, unless we're identifying with them, unless we're making them mean something, unless we are stuck in a story of this is who I think I am based on the personal mind, well, then something shifts and they start, maybe not overnight, but they start to see something. They start to question, well, maybe this isn't who I am. Maybe this is just a story that I've told myself again and again and again. And I've just somewhere along the line believed that story. I've believed that the way that I felt was coming from my job, was coming from my workload. And I'm not saying that there isn't pressure in the work that we do, but there is a difference between stress and pressure. And how we're experiencing that moment has got nothing to do with what it is that they're dealing with. It's got nothing to do with their workload, with whatever it is that they're working on. It is all about who they are being, what sense of self they are operating from. You know, how many times have you experienced dealing with a situation at work and feeling like this is just too much? I don't have time. Look at my diary. Oh my God, my boss is doing my head in. My co-worker, I'm ready to strangle my co-worker. And it all just feels too much. And so we make these assumptions, we make these associations that the way I'm feeling is because of all of this. And yet there are other days, same situation, same to-do list, same boss, same co-worker, and yet we have a very different experience. We're just ticking things off the to-do list. We're feeling grounded, we're calm. We're not in our heads overthinking things. So we're having a very different experience. And so the more that we can point people back to what is fundamentally creating their experience, that is what is going to shift the needle. If we are truly committed to transforming well-being in the workplace, well-being in the workplace does not mean constantly giving people tools and techniques. It doesn't mean giving them more and more information of basically how to manage the mind. Because the more that we give people, it just creates even more noise in the mind. It's like, oh, I've got to do this technique, or I've got to manage my diary this way, or I've got to do this, I've got to do that. It creates all of this noise, this chatter in the mind. It keeps people locked in these habitual thought loops. It sends them deeper and deeper into their normal habitual thought patterns. So if we want to truly create a workplace where people are able to operate from natural resilience, then we need to give them the understanding of what is creating their experience. And I remember one of my private clients that I worked with last year, he was a guy who's about 38, and he works for one of the big UK banks. And he'd started to develop OCD and anxiety when he was 5. It's a really, really long time to be spending in a state of anxiety, in this constant fear of what might happen, what could go wrong, that worst case scenario thinking. And when he started to see what was actually creating his experience, when he started to understand the nature of thought, and he started to see thoughts are just like clouds in the sky, that who he is isn't those clouds, that the less focus and attention he gave those thoughts, then they would just drift through his mind, because thoughts come and they go. And that fundamentally shifted the anxiety. He spent more and more time feeling settled, feeling safe in his body. And he got to a point where he said, my mental health has never been so good. And not only did that impact his relationships, his lifetime, well, it did impact his lifetime, his lifestyle, his enjoyment at life, but it also had a direct impact on his work. Because if we're trying to do things at work and we're constantly in our head, we're constantly in these thought loops, we're second guessing ourselves, we're doubting ourselves, and then we want to try and be productive, guess what? That's going to be hard work. If we're trying to come up with solutions and ideas, when we've got all of this mental chatter going on, then it's going to take us far longer to see whatever we need to see. And I'm sure that you've experienced this, where maybe you've been locked in one of those brainstorming team events where you're going round and round and round in circles, trying to find the solution to something. And then somebody says, you know what, let's just take some time out. Let's just take a natural break. We use the bathroom, we make a cup of tea, and everyone's like, oh yeah, good idea, good idea. And it's when you're making a cup of tea or you're getting a glass of water or you're even in the toilet that suddenly it's like, oh, I've had an idea. And guess what? That idea was able to drop into the mind because the mind suddenly became quiet because you weren't all locked in a meeting room going round and round and round in circles. And the thing about our thinking, especially in these kind of situations, is we think that we're thinking about the situation, but we're not. We're just thinking about our thinking. And where there's one thought, there's another thought, and there's another thought. But if we're not aware that we're in our thinking, instead of being in this present moment where we have access to this knowledge, this intelligence, this innate wisdom, well, then things are going to be a lot more difficult than they need to be. So by giving people this understanding, this isn't just about health and well-being in the workplace. This has a ripple effect into everything. You know, if I think about a sales team, if you've got a sales team that are anxious and worried that they're not going to hit their sales target, and they're going into a potential meeting with a client, well, guess what kind of signal they're potentially going to be sending out? And people feel that. They feel that. And when we're caught in our thinking, we're not as creative. We're not as present. We're not just in a natural state where we're building a relationship, where we're really trying to find out what the client, the customer needs. Because our mind is consumed with, I've got to get this sale. I've got to get this contract. I've got to meet my sales targets. And can you imagine the difference between having a meeting, especially if we're talking big ticket items, the organizations that I've worked with, some of the services they provide, they're not just a couple of £100. We're talking millions. Do you want to be dealing with somebody that's like constantly in their head, constantly overthinking, that's operating from a place of stress and worry and doubt and insecurity? Or do you want to be in the presence of somebody that's calm, that's fully present, that's really listening, that's grounded? It's the same with management mental health training. You know, one of the things that I've seen with management mental health training is the vast majority of people that have gone through our management mental health training didn't even recognize that they were pretty much operating from the stress response. If you've got a manager that's managing their team from the stress response, other people are going to pick up on that. It's going to create this environment where everybody's on edge, that their nervous system's in this state of hypervigilance. So when it comes to any kind of conversation, whether it's a conversation about projects, deadlines, mental health, well-being, well, who do you want to be having a conversation with? Do you want to be having a conversation with a manager who isn't present, that is in that stress response? Or do you want to be having a conversation with a manager that, again, is regulated, is calm, is present? You know, think about the experiences that you've had. What have been the best experiences that you've had when you're having conversations with your own line managers? You know, is it the one that's constantly interrupting, checking their phone, losing their shit? Or is it one that's present, that's calm? And you can feel that. You can feel it at that level of the unconscious mind. You can feel it in your energy system when somebody is present and regulated, and that ripples out to everything. But if people don't even realize how much they are caught in their thinking, which so many people don't, until they start to develop their self-awareness, until they start getting really good at noticing, I'm in my thinking again. And then they're able to return back to that awareness, well, then they're just going to keep doing what they've always done because it makes sense to them. Or they just don't even have the awareness that they're even overthinking everything. But one of the leaders that I've been working with since the beginning of the year, another lady that works for a big UK bank. I think I just need to go and work for a UK bank. I could completely transform them. I've had so many clients, private clients from UK banks. We need to get this training into the financial industry. But you know, she was an amazing woman, very, very competent, had worked her way all the way up the career ladder. But at the beginning, my God, she was constantly in her head, constantly overthinking everything. And she didn't realize or perhaps appreciate how much she was overthinking until she started to get really good at noticing it and really good at coming back to the awareness, seeing that this actually was just a thought. And that thought wasn't giving her any information. It was a recycled thought. It was a habitual thought. And when we see that, these thoughts, they lose power. So I would love to hear how this episode has landed with you. What is it that you've seen today that perhaps you hadn't seen before? And if this is something that you would absolutely love to bring into the workplace to truly revolutionize the well-being in the workplace of your organization, then please do book a consultation. But until then, I look forward to you joining me on another episode very shortly.